Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free, the sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier.
Welcome to another episode of Rising Tide the Ocean podcast. This is David Helvarg, and I'm joined by my co-host Vicki Nichols-Goldstein of the Inland Ocean Coalition, which seems particularly appropriate for today's topic. Welcome, Vicki.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to have a conversation with Nancy today.
Yeah, it's been over 2 years since we last got to speak with Dr. Nancy Rabalais of the Department of Oceanography and Coastal Sciences at Louisiana State University. In August, she released her latest report on the state of the seasonal dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. That's the result of agricultural runoff from the Midwest that flows down the Mississippi every year with spring rains. This year, it's about the size of Rhode Island, although in the past, she said it's grown as large as New Jersey. Well, best known for her work on the dead zone, Nancy's also studied the impacts of the 2010 BP oil spill on the Gulf and other aspects of our changing ocean. She's received many honors, including one of our Peter Benchley Ocean Awards for excellence in science. So, Nancy, it's great to talk with you again, and we want to hear about your latest report. But first, some blue news you can use. In July, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Department of Interior reached an agreement to promote civilian nuclear power projects on our public seas. On the same day, the Department of Transportation and Port of Long Beach, California, agreed to test small nuclear reactors for commercial vessels and port operations. Given his hatred of clean offshore wind power going back to 2013 when Scotland permitted wind farms off his Aberdeen golf resort, it's not surprising that along with attacking offshore wind and pushing for more offshore oil drilling, Donald Trump's people would think offshore nukes is another great idea. Right now, Russia has a floating nuclear power station at an Arctic port, plus 8 nuclear-powered icebreakers. And that's not even counting the nuclear submarines it scuttled without removing their reactor cores. One company invested in developing barge-based nukes and nuclear shipping is the British-based Core Power. 5 years ago, they cut a deal with Westinghouse for the design and development of floating nuclear power plants. At an event in Houston just last year, Core Power CEO promised to bring floating nuclear power to market by the mid-2030s. Like AI data centers and crypto mines before them, floating nukes may be the next big thing no one knows about until it happens. And citizens don't really like being blindsided like that. Just consider the growing grassroots opposition to data centers. Still, when it comes to the ocean, its potential remains unlimited, even if, like Donald Trump, your view of that potential is as a gas station, deep-sea mining site, a place for floating nukes that would probably have to be insured by the government, and of course a garbage dump full of sharks out to get you. And that's blue news you can use. And we're back. So Nancy, before we get to the state of the dead zone, let's start with a brief recap of your history, how you got from Texas to Louisiana and out onto the Gulf.
Thank you very much for having me here today. I came to Louisiana from Texas to take a job. I graduated with my PhD, so it was time to move on. And I went to Louisiana University's Marine Consortium in Cocodrie, Louisiana, where I was on the water basically every day and started working in Barataria Bay and then offshore in Louisiana coastal waters. And that's where I've maintained my research ever since.
And you really did a lot of the original research to identify the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And maybe you could explain what that is and how it's grown.
Right. The word dead zone is fairly ominous, but it is a unfortunate situation in the Gulf of Mexico. It results from the high nutrient inputs from the Mississippi River that delivers nutrient-rich waters to the Gulf of Mexico. And those waters stimulate the growth of phytoplankton in the surface waters. Those that aren't eaten by zooplankton and fish sink to the bottom where they decompose, and that decomposition uses up the oxygen that's in the bottom waters. So you end up having oxygen depleted waters, which are commonly known as dead zones.
So what is the current size? I know not everyone knows the size difference between New Jersey and Rhode Island. So it's kind of a subtle. So tell us more about the size as we begin to explore the dead zone.
The low oxygen area is about 13,300 square miles large. It covers basically the area of coastal Louisiana from the Mississippi River Delta about as far as the Texas-Louisiana border. Within about 5 kilometers of the shoreline, it starts to develop when the water's deep enough for the stratification to occur, the layering of the water column, and then out to 40 miles or so from there. So an area from 5 to 40 miles offshore along the full Louisiana coast. It's I think it's the second largest such coastal area of low oxygen in the world's oceans. The Baltic Sea has much larger area.
How do you heard about it from fishermen? When did you start basically identifying its size and impacts?
I think my first research cruise was in the 1970s, where the director of the Marine Lab at the time, Dr. Don Bosch, had a similar situation in Chesapeake Bay where he came from and knew that it was in the Gulf of Mexico and just suggested that I start trying to document it and locate it and find out what time of the year and where it was and how severe it was. And so I just went from there, and he supported the research for a while. And then I got funding from NOAA, from other sources, Sea Grant, to study it.
So you were the first person basically who just initiated this study and have tracked it.
Well, there are some more historic, I want to call them historic people who looked at low oxygen in the Gulf of Mexico, because one of them is my husband, Gene Turner. I don't want to call him historic. He might take exception to that. But he and others had been out there and found the low oxygen and documented it and reported it, but they didn't have any dedicated funding to focus specifically on that. And ours were the first studies that were able to focus on it over time and in space.
With somebody who lives in Colorado, like myself, and who runs the Inland Ocean Coalition, I'm always trying to help people understand how their actions inland affect the ocean. So I know you mentioned in your intro these nutrients are delivered, but can you give us a little bit more information about how it's delivered? Like, what does that really mean?
The area that the nutrients come from is large. It goes from Tennessee, Western New York on the east, all the way to areas in Montana on the west, and as far north as North Dakota, South Dakota, and even reaches into Canada. So that watershed that drains into the Mississippi River is a large watershed, and it brings a lot of water from many areas across the U.S. Some of them have more nutrients than others. For instance, the Ohio River has very high nutrient levels because there are a lot more population centers along the river in Ohio than there are in the main stem of the Mississippi River. The urban centers are usually point sources, something that comes out of the end of a pipe, sewage or industrial wastewater. But the majority of it does come from over the land, runs off the land and into the adjacent streams and waterways, and then gets into the Mississippi River.
So all of the fertilizers and pesticides.
Yes,
everything.
fertilizers, pesticides, any other toxics that might be in the water all end up in the river and end up eventually in the Gulf of Mexico. Some of them will be taken up and modified along the way, but the majority of what gets into the river gets into the Gulf.
So if David and I went diving with you, what would we actually see in this dead zone? What does it look like?
The water on the surface might be semi-clear, but there's almost always some phytoplankton in that water that give it a green tint or sometimes a brown coloration. Then as say I'm in 60 feet of water and I go down through the water column, at about halfway down, that clear water becomes cloudier. And by the time you get to the bottom, it's pretty turbid. And there's not much light that penetrates all the way to the bottom. Enough light penetrates to the bottom that photosynthesis can occur at the bottom in the algae that live on the sediments. But the amount of oxygen that's generated in those bottom waters is fairly minimal.
Basically, as the dead zone or the deoxygenated water spreads, finfish and others kind of move away from it, but then you get like brittle stars and clams and the like that would
Right.
just die on the bottom.
Right. The water, as it moves towards the shore or offshore, the organisms that are in that low oxygen water will move with it. No, they'll move towards the shore, move further offshore. The organisms that live in the sediments, such as starfish, some burrowing crabs and burrowing shrimp, they won't be able to escape, and many of them will die if the oxygen falls low enough or long enough.
Do you often see animals washed along the shoreline during these dead zone periods?
Every now and then we'll have something called a jubilee, where the winds will come from the north and push the surface waters offshore, which allows the bottom waters to be pulled onto the shore. And that's when fish will be trapped and sometimes die, and those fish will end up on the shoreline dead.
And it was called a jubilee because people would come and collect the dead fish.
This is great. Look at all the fish we've got.
Oh my gosh.
This nutrient pollution, for 20 and 30 years, we've had this conversation. A lot of it is waste, farm waste. You know, if the fertilizer doesn't get into the rootstock, then anything that runs off into the Mississippi is like surplus and waste. And it seems like it would make sense for a lot of farmers to be more focused in their application, use GPS, use all these techniques to reduce the runoff, which would save them money too. But that doesn't seem to have really happened to date.
Well, I would say that some farmers do use those techniques. The land is it's their resource, and they want to treat it well. And they do try to treat it well by using less fertilizers than is necessary to grow the crop. There are studies that show that there's an excess of use of fertilizers by the agricultural community to generate the amount of crops that they generate. I would expect that the cost of the fertilizer is relatively minor compared to other parts of the operation of the agricultural land and over those expansive areas.
Yeah, well, I know a lot of the farmers are moving more towards regenerative ag and organics. Have
Right.
seen any improvements with these dead zones since the farmers have become more aware?
If there were a big change in agricultural practices that were taking over a huge area of the U.S., I would expect to see a change offshore, but I can't anticipate that would happen easily or readily or right away.
And the government commodity subsidies and the farm bill don't really encourage a move away from this kind of industrial agriculture that focuses on certain crops like corn and soy.
What is Rising Tide? Rising Tide is Blue Frontier's bi-weekly half-hour show that features a diversity of ocean voices, from the famous to the fascinating, deep-sea explorers to whale wranglers, Arctic residents to climate justice warriors. With public broadcasting under attack, Blue Frontier offers Rising Tide and all associated content for free to community and public radio stations across the nation. We need your support to keep producing our salty, in-depth conversations. A tax-deductible donation at bluefront.org will help us keep getting the word out about our awesome blue planet. And now, back to the show.
This year's report that you just put out the dead zone wasn't smaller because there's less nutrients being fed into it. You were saying it's more like other factors like a hurricane that took place, or
Well, we had Hurricane Bertha come through, and that mixed up the water column offshore. And that's one reason that the size was smaller. So it wasn't just fewer nutrients getting in, it was the physical mixing of the water column from the surface to the bottom that brought oxygen to the bottom and rejuvenated the low oxygen area. So that was a physical factor that was related to the improvement in the low oxygen offshore this year.
It's interesting that hurricanes are actually improving the water quality and the oxygen in these coastal areas that really need this mixing up.
It's an unusual juxtaposition. Yes, yes.
I often will give presentations and show the watershed map of the United States, and it is remarkable to me how huge this central Mississippi, Missouri River drainage basin is. I mean, it's
Right. It is.
quarters of the size of the United States. So when you think about all of the urban impact and the plastics and the chemicals and the fertilizers, and we could go on, it all ends up through the rivers and the streams. It's going down and collecting in the Mississippi and then dumping out right at the mouth. So it is a lot, and it would take a lot of effort to change land use policies to connect
And-
to ocean health.
And most of the water moves from the river delta towards the west along the Louisiana coast. Not as much goes to the east, but you do have low oxygen areas to the east as well. And I've studied those several years ago.
Similar impacts as well as
Similar impacts, right? Reduced benthos, animals living in the sediments were reduced.
and that was impacts coming off of Florida, or where were the nutrients?
No, it was from the Mississippi River water moving to the east. Some of it moves to the east, and there's such a tremendous volume of water that it does impact the area to the east as it does in a similar fashion to the west.
regarding the dead zone, it's more of a seasonal impact. Is that correct?
The sequence is that beginning in the spring, as the water's warm and there's plenty of nutrients in the water, a lot of river flow going into the Gulf of Mexico, that's when the algae will grow in the surface waters and bloom. They eventually will be taken up into the food web, either through zooplankton or fish, and then be caught by humans or not, and then go on living their happy lives offshore.
A live fish is a happy fish.
Yeah. And then those impacts you don't see the effects. You see the effects of the algal blooms in the spring early. You can see it in the winter sometimes, early in the spring, through the spring, and through the summer. And then as the freshwater inflow drops in the summer and the amount of nutrients getting into the Gulf decrease, then you see less of a surface algal bloom and less flux of materials to the bottom and less low oxygen.
So my follow-up question was just if you have seen any correlation between the dead zone and any economic impact with commercial fishermen or shrimpers or businesses or even tourism with these high dead zone areas.
There are so many other factors that influence the number of people who come to the coast and what they do when they come to the coast, that it's difficult to segregate their actions totally unrelated to putting nutrients in the water from just going to the coastal zone.
Like maybe go to Mardi Gras and eat and drink versus having an impact on that ocean.
Well, if they go to Mardi Gras and eat and drink, some of those nutrients are going to get to the Gulf of Mexico.
But they might not be impacted
Also.
directly by it.
Yeah.
But commercial fishing, shrimpers, and the like, they're
They complain a lot, with reason sometimes, but they don't particularly pick on low oxygen as a reason for them not catching anything. It's usually that somebody else is fishing their territory or something else.
Got it. You had mentioned, and I have seen this in the Baltic Sea, taking a ferry, the green. So you mentioned if that zone was Gulf of Mexico in the Baltic. Are there any other significant international dead zones?
Well, Chesapeake Bay has one. They have large algal blooms and extremely low oxygen on the bottom. The Adriatic Sea, areas of the Adriatic Sea have very low oxygen. The area off of Germany, the German Bight, similar idea with rivers bringing nutrients and the development of phytoplankton and low oxygen areas there. The fjords of Sweden and Denmark and Norway have water that's deep and doesn't get mixed as much. And that's more of a natural occurrence there
Right.
than
Like
a
with the Black
human.
Sea also kind of
Right,
naturally an oxy.
right. Than a human induced, but humans can magnify the impacts in some of those places.
But those nutrient runoffs, I mean, you've got the dead zone that you've been able to map and measure, and I know you don't like being called mother of the dead zones, but you've
Right.
you, you've been doing it a long time.
I
But
have been.
but the nutrients
Grandmother.
also they have other effects. I mean, the harmful algal blooms that they're getting in Florida, for example,
Right,
also fed by warm water nutrient runoff, and we're seeing a lot
right,
more of those even here in California.
right. The nutrients will stimulate the growth of phytoplankton, some of which can generate toxins, such as the ones in Florida, and sometimes in Louisiana waters you'll get toxic algal blooms, but they're not long lived, at least in Louisiana. They're longer lived in Florida, so they see many more impacts there than we do off of Louisiana. They do occur. You see reddish water at times. You see pea green water at times. You know, there's definitely something growing in the water that's phytoplankton.
And this nutrients also, I mean, this summer there's a lot of reporting. It's kind of like seaweeds gone wild with the sargassum in Florida, the Caribbean, Mexico. I know in Asia it's sea lettuce, but it's the same effect.
Right, right.
It seems like we've got a nutrient problem on our coasts.
We do. We also have weather, which in the summer is warmer than it is in the winter. And part of that stimulates the growth of these, like the fucus and the seaweed that grows in the Gulf. You get more in the summer just because it's warmer and there's still sufficient nutrients to keep it going. There are times where you can go offshore and there'll just be rafts of the sargassum weed everywhere. Eventually decompose and sink to the bottom.
Yeah, we've got a lot of challenges, as we've just discussed, but could recommend a couple of actions that you think would make the biggest difference in reducing this dead zone? I mean, things inland and coastal, what would they be?
Well, I think they're all inland because the coastal margins in the northern Gulf don't contribute that many nutrients compared to what's coming down the Mississippi River, the Ohio, the Missouri. It's just minuscule compared to that input.
I
So
think
it's
the coastal margins in Louisiana mostly retreating.
right, and those marshes take up nutrients naturally. So it's a natural removal mechanism along the coast. So that definitely helps Louisiana and other areas that are coastal. Seagrass meadows will do the same thing. They'll take up nutrients.
So the
Yeah.
solutions are upstream, really. And
Really, they are.
how much education you think has taken place since you first started identifying and mapping the dead zone? I mean, I've talked to a few farmers who are kind of the gold standard in terms of using satellites, GPS, very conscious, as you say, very good stewards of their land. But how much education is taking place in the inland ocean realm?
There's a lot of education because there are favorite watering holes and fishing spots in Wisconsin that have the same problem with too much algae sinking to the bottom, decomposing, and then you have a fish kill. So it happens in water bodies within the watershed. So it's mentally linking what's happening in a local watershed with what's happening in the Gulf is probably a far reach for some people, but it might seem like just what would be expected if there's just too much algae growing in the surface waters.
And it's actually because it also impacts local drinking water. It's become a political issue in Kansas and Iowa and elsewhere.
That's a big issue with drinking water quality. A big issue. Yeah. Nitrate in drinking water it's not good.
What happens inland, you can see the results on the coast, and we're
Yeah.
all connected with our
Yeah.
actions. And all we can do is vote for the ocean, vote for clean water, and be conscientious.
Because you spend so much time kind of identifying this dead zone and the problems associated. But just tell us what you love about the Gulf of Mexico and the things that you take pleasure in.
I love being out in the open water. You're out in a boat, and if it's calm, it's really even nicer. And as far as you can see, there's water. It might be brown water, it might be green water. If you go far enough offshore, it'll be blue water, but it's just an immense water body. And you feel so small in the middle of that immensity that it's just really a unusual feeling that not many people have had.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nancy Rabalais, world's leading expert on coastal hypoxia and dead zones, and many other wonderful things, for joining us on the Rising Tide Ocean podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on the Rising Tide Ocean podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Leave us a review and share Rising Tide with your friends. Follow us on Instagram and check out bluefront.org for more ocean resources and connections. Rising Tide is a production of Blue Frontier, co-hosted by David Helvarg and Vicki Nichols-Goldstein of the Inland Ocean Coalition, with support from producer Holden Hardcastle of Fluid Studios, editing services by Charles Landon of Studio Cape May, and additional support from Blue Frontier's Natasha Benjamin and Nick Paz. This is Joy Lele Shikazado of Blue Frontier, asking you to stay hopeful and stay salty.
Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the Blue Frontier. Off in the salty ocean, off to the Blue Frontier.
Sparky, come here, buddy. Sparky! There you are. Good boy, Sparky.